She moved to the farmhouse of a man she barely knew, bound by a marriage that existed only on paper, and found something no one expected to grow in that abandoned soil. Can you imagine signing your name on a marriage certificate, knowing it was nothing more than a cold agreement of convenience, where the vows were merely hollow words? That the ring on your finger signified not love, but legal protection for two strangers who needed to solve problems imposed by society? But this story happened in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia in March of 1902, when a woman named Julianne Vance discovered that the most calculated contracts can transform into the truest feelings. Before we continue, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from right now. It is vital so this channel can keep bringing these emotional stories to you. And if you are enjoying this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any stories of overcoming odds and true love. Julianne knew the bitter taste of loneliness long before she turned 28. She was born in 1874, the daughter of a respected merchant and a woman whose exotic beauty always sparked whispers in town. Julianne's mother, Teresa, had native blood in her veins, a heritage from a maternal grandmother who had come from the deep woods of the Appalachians. That ancestry brought with it ancient knowledge of plants, roots, teas, and salves that cured everything from stubborn fevers to wounds the doctors had already given up on. Teresa taught all of this to Julianne when the girl was still small, in the back of the house, far from the judgmental eyes of a society that called it primitive witchcraft. Julianne grew up divided between two worlds. In the front parlor, she learned French, piano, embroidery, and the etiquette a young lady of good family ought to master. In the backyard, during the secret hours of the afternoon, she learned to recognize leaves by their scent, to prepare poultices that drew out pain, and to cultivate seedlings no one else knew how to keep alive. Her mother always repeated that this knowledge was a sacred gift, a heritage that could not die, but needed to be protected, because the world was not yet ready to respect wisdom that came from the earth rather than European books. When Julianne turned 19, her father arranged her marriage to Augustus Gus Miller, the son of a prosperous landowner, a man 10 years her senior who seemed like a promise of a secure future. The wedding took place on a September morning in 1893 with a solemn service, a dress of French lace and a party that lasted until dawn. Julianne entered that matrimony with the naive hope that affection would come with time, as all married women guaranteed it would. But Augustus revealed his true nature within the first week. He drank, not just at dinners or parties, but every day, from morning until he passed out at night. And when he drank, he transformed into a bitter creature who blamed his wife for frustrations he himself created. Julianne spent 6 years in that marriage, which was a prison disguised as a respectable home. 6 years hearing she was defective for not conceiving. 6 years hiding the emotional misery she lived from her family. 6 years keeping the botanical knowledge her mother taught her to herself because Augustus said it was savage nonsense, and she should be ashamed. She thought of running away dozens of times, but to where? A married woman had nowhere to go. She had no money of her own, no rights, no voice. So Julianne learned to survive by becoming invisible, small, silent. In April of 1899, Augustus rode out drunk on a rainy night and plunged down a ravine. They found his body the next morning, neck broken, eyes still open, staring at the grey sky. Julianne cried at the wake as a widow was expected to cry, but the tears were of relief, not longing. She was 25 years old and finally free, or so she thought. The reality of young widowhood arrived slowly, like a frost that kills the crops bit by bit. Augustus's father took back the small house where she lived. Her family, though welcoming, made it clear that a young woman without a husband was a burden that couldn't last forever. Julianne needed an occupation, an income, a purpose. That was when a vacancy for a teacher at the county schoolhouse opened up, a modest position that paid enough for her to rent a simple room and gain crumbs of independence. She dedicated herself to teaching with the fervor of someone finding redemption in work. The children adored her because Julianne had infinite patience and a gentle way of explaining difficult things. She taught grammar, arithmetic, history and geography, but also, in spare moments, she showed the girls how to tend small gardens, how to brew teas that soothed a stomachache, how to recognize poisonous ivy. She did this discreetly, always afraid someone would call it witchcraft, and she would lose everything again. For 3 years, Julianne built a small but dignified life. She woke early, walked to the schoolhouse, taught, returned to her room, read by candlelight, and slept. On Sundays, she visited her mother, who was increasingly frail, with a cough no tea could cure anymore. It was her mother who first noticed that her daughter's happiness was incomplete, built only on the absence of suffering, not the presence of true joy. Teresa said Julianne needed to find a man who saw in her not just a convenient wife, but a companion of the soul. Julianne would smile sadly and reply that such men did not exist outside the French romances she read in secret. Then, in February of 1902, fate began to weave the net that would trap Julianne again. The new head of the school board, a conservative man from the state capital, implemented an absurd rule. Due to moral concerns, only married women could remain in the teaching post. The official justification was that a single woman or a widow without male supervision lacked the adequate moral standing to educate the town's children. Julianne received the news like a punch to the stomach. She had until the end of April to marry, or she would be dismissed. She spent weeks in silent despair. Her family, well-meaning but suffocating, began presenting suitors. Old widowers who needed someone to keep house, indebted merchants who wanted a dowry she didn't have, rough farmers who could barely read and were looking for a breeding mare, not a partner. Julianne refused them all, even knowing time was slipping through her fingers like fine sand. It was Mrs. Higgins, the parson's elderly wife, who brought the strange proposal one March afternoon. They were having tea in the parlour of the parsonage when the lady commented, with disconcerting naturalness, that she knew a solution to Julianne's problem. There was a farmer, Michael Carver, a decent and prosperous man, who also urgently needed a wife. Not for love or desire, but for legal necessity. Mrs. Higgins explained that Michael was about to lose custody of his orphaned niece, the only family he had left. The girl's maternal relatives, high society people from Richmond, had filed a lawsuit alleging that a single man had no conditions to raise a 7-year-old girl. The judge was inclined to agree with them. Michael needed a respectable, educated wife who would make that house suitable for a child in the eyes of the law. He didn't need romance. He needed an agreement. Julianne listened to all of this with a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. Mrs. Higgins continued, saying that Michael was a man of his word, that he would offer a comfortable home, financial security, and respect. Each would have their separate quarters, their separate lives. The marriage would exist only on paper and in public appearances. She would solve his problem, he would solve hers. Simple as that, cold as that. Julianne spent 3 days thinking, turning the proposal over from every angle like someone examining a stone for cracks. She talked to her mother, who was so weak she could barely leave her bed. Teresa held her daughter's hand with surprising strength and said something that would stay engraved forever. Sometimes, life puts the right people on the wrong path, and it's up to us to see if we can turn the path around. It wasn't clear advice, but Julianne understood. Her mother was saying that not everything that starts as convenience needs to end that way. On the 4th day, Julianne sent word to Mrs. Higgins saying she agreed to meet this farmer. The meeting was set for the following Sunday at the parsonage itself, neutral territory where both could appraise one another like cattle at a fair. Julianne spent the whole morning choosing a discreet but pretty dress, navy blue with white details at the collar. She pinned her brown hair in a low bun, put on the crochet shawl her mother had made, took a deep breath, and walked to the parson's house with her heart beating out of rhythm. Michael Carver was already there when she arrived. He stood up upon seeing her enter, and Julianne had her first impression of him standing against the light of the window. He was tall, with broad shoulders of one who works the land, hands large and calloused. His face was angular, marked by sun and time, beard trimmed with care, dark hair already greying at the temples. His eyes were deep brown, serious but not cruel. He wore simple but clean clothes, a dark coat and a tie that seemed to bother him. There was something about him like an old tree, solid, that faces storms without breaking, but also without dancing in the wind. "Good morning," Michael said with a gravelly voice, slightly husky. Julianne returned the greeting and sat in the chair Mrs. Higgins indicated. The lady served coffee, offered biscuits, and then, with admirable tact, invented an excuse to leave the room, leaving the two alone. The silence that settled was as dense as mountain fog. Michael was the one who broke the ice. "I imagine Mrs. Higgins has already explained the situation," he began, looking at his own hands. Julianne confirmed she had. He continued, choosing words with care, like someone stepping on ground they don't know well. "I need to be honest. I am not looking for a wife in the traditional sense. I cannot offer love because I don't know if I am still capable of feeling it. But I can offer respect, security, a comfortable home, and freedom for you to maintain your dignity and your work. I only need that. Before society and the law, we be husband and wife. In private, we will be just two people sharing the same roof. Nothing more." Julianne heard all of this, processing every word. She asked about the niece, about what would be expected of her regarding the girl. Michael softened his expression for the first time. "Laura is a good child," he said with genuine tenderness that contrasted with his previous hardness. "She lost her parents 8 months ago, a carriage accident. She's been with me since then. I don't need you to be her mother. I just need the judge to see there is an adequate female presence in the house, someone to teach what I don't know how to teach." Julianne felt something strange hearing that, a mixture of compassion and identification. She also knew what it was to lose those you love. She asked for more practical details, what the routine would be, where she would sleep, if she would be allowed to keep her own belongings and customs. Michael answered everything with surprising frankness. The farmhouse had 2 main bedrooms in opposite wings of the house. She could choose whichever she wanted. There would be a cook, a groundskeeper, 2 maids. She would be the lady of the house in domestic command. He would not interfere, nor would he stop her from continuing to teach at the school, if that was her wish, although she wouldn't be obliged to work anymore. And as for... Julianne hesitated, searching for delicate words. As for expectations of conjugal cohabitation? Michael understood immediately and shook his head. "None of that," he guaranteed firmly. "This is a marriage on paper. I will not demand anything you do not wish to offer, my word of honor." There was something in the way he said it, looking directly into her eyes, that made Julianne believe him. She then asked a question that caught him by surprise. "And if one of us changes our mind? If in the future we want to end the agreement?" Michael remained silent for a long moment. "Then we will have an honest conversation and find a solution," he finally answered. "I am not a man to hold anyone against their will." Julianne took a deep breath and made a decision that would completely change the course of her life. "I accept the proposal," she said with a voice firmer than she felt. "But I also have conditions. I want to continue teaching. I want to have a small space on the farm, perhaps a plot where I can cultivate medicinal plants. It is something important to me." Michael nodded immediately. "You can have whatever space you want on the property," he agreed. "There is land to spare." They settled other practical details with the efficiency of two people negotiating a commercial contract. The wedding would be in 2 weeks, a small ceremony with only necessary witnesses. Julianne would move to the farm the day after the ceremony. There would be no party, no pretense of romance, just signatures on a document and the start of an arrangement that would benefit both. When Julianne left the parsonage that afternoon, the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, covered in hardwood forest. She walked slowly back home, feeling the strangeness of having just decided her own destiny in such a cold and calculated way. There was no happiness, but there was no despair either. Just pragmatic acceptance that sometimes life offers imperfect solutions to impossible problems. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind. Julianne told her mother, who smiled with sadness and blessed her daughter, asking for protection. She told the school principal, who was satisfied with the solution to the problem. She packed her few belongings, books, clothes, the notebooks where her mother had written down botanical remedies, some plant seedlings she kept in small pots on her bedroom window. The wedding took place on a cold April morning inside the small main church, with only 6 people present. The parson, Mrs. Higgins as a witness, Julianne, Michael, and a couple of acquaintances from the farm. Laura did not go. She stayed home with the cook. The ceremony lasted 15 minutes. The parson read the traditional vows with the haste of someone who has other appointments. Julianne and Michael repeated the words, promising eternal love, absolute fidelity, companionship, until death did them part. Both knew those words were theatre, a script memorized for an invisible audience called society. When the parson said the groom could kiss the bride, Michael merely touched her forehead lightly with his lips, a chaste gesture that seemed more like a formal greeting than a matrimonial kiss. They signed the register, heard unenthusiastic congratulations from those present, and left the church as husband and wife before God and the law. Outside, the buggy that would take Julianne to her new life waited. She climbed up with Michael's help, who then stowed her small trunk in the back. The trip to the farm would take an hour across dirt roads that cut through the Virginia hills. During the journey, they spoke little. Michael commented occasionally on landmarks they passed. That curve was dangerous when it rained. That fence marked the beginning of his land. That creek provided clean water all year round. Julianne just listened and observed the landscape. The region possessed a wild beauty. Mountains covered in intense green, mist clinging to the valleys, cold and damp air that smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves. It was different from the town where she had grown up, closer to the valley floor. Here, everything seemed more closed in, more secret, as if nature itself kept ancient mysteries between the trees. The farmhouse finally appeared in a wide clearing surrounded by dense woods. It was a large property, with a main house of 2 stories built in the federal style, white clapboard walls and a slate roof, wide porches protected by wooden columns. Around it were other, smaller buildings, the caretaker's cottage, the granary, the stable, the tobacco barn, all well kept, solid, prosperous. Michael raised dairy cattle and grew tobacco on a smaller scale than the great plantation owners, but enough to live very well. There was also pasture for horses, a chicken coop, and a practical vegetable garden near the kitchen. Michael drove the buggy to the front of the house and helped Julianne down. Before he could grab the trunk, the door opened and a robust woman of about 60 appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. "This is Mrs. Beatrice," Michael introduced. "She has taken care of the house and kitchen for over 20 years. Beatrice, this is Mrs. Julianne, my wife." Beatrice had sharp eyes that assessed Julianne from head to toe in 2 seconds, but then she smiled, a genuine smile that illuminated a face wrinkled by time and work. "Welcome, ma'am," she said with a warm voice. "It's been a long time since this house needed a real woman's presence." There was something in the way she said that, with a subtle emphasis on real, that made Julianne suspect Beatrice knew exactly the nature of that marriage. But the cook showed no judgment, only practical kindness. Michael carried Julianne's trunk inside. The house was simple inside but comfortable. The main parlour had dark wood furniture, sofas with embroidered cushions, rugs worn but clean, a bookshelf that surprised Julianne. The kitchen was ample, with a large wood-burning stove, a massive wooden table, well-organized cupboards. There was a hallway leading to the bedrooms. Michael showed her the room that would be hers on the east side of the house. It was a spacious room, with a double bed covered by a patchwork quilt, a hardwood wardrobe, a dresser with a mirror, a chair near the window that looked out to the side of the property. It smelled of lavender and clean linen. "I hope it is suitable," Michael said, depositing the trunk on the floor. "If you need anything, you can ask Beatrice or me." His room was on the opposite side of the house, he explained, pointing vaguely down the hall. Between them lay a physical distance that mirrored the emotional distance of their agreement. Julianne thanked him, and Michael left, closing the door. She stood there in the center of the room, feeling the weight of the strangeness of being in a house that wasn't hers, married to a man she didn't know, living a lie that was accepted as truth. She sat on the bed, touched the soft quilt, looked out the window at the infinite green surrounding that place. She thought of her mother, of the last years of sadness, of the choices she had made. She wondered if she was making a terrible mistake, or if it was exactly what she needed to do. She had no answer. That first night, Julianne dined with Michael and Laura in the dining room. The girl was small for 7 years old, light brown hair tied in 2 braids, big curious eyes that observed Julianne with poorly disguised interest. She was polite but reserved, answering when asked, but not initiating conversation. Julianne realized that Laura still carried a deep sadness from the loss of her parents, a sadness that manifested not in tears, but in silences and distant looks. The girl ate little, asked to be excused before dessert, and went up to her room. Michael explained that she had nightmares some nights, and that Mrs. Beatrice usually took care of her during those moments. His voice carried the guilt of someone who feels they are not enough. After dinner, Julianne retired to her room. She lay in the strange bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the farm, the wind in the trees, the chirping of crickets, the occasional distant lowing of cattle, the creaking of the old house's wood. It took a long time to sleep. When she finally drifted off, she dreamed of forgotten gardens and plants growing in impossible places. The first days were a strange adjustment. Julianne and Michael established a routine of polite and distant coexistence. They had breakfast together for appearances, in case anyone on the property was nearby. They usually ate lunch separately, he in the fields tending to business, she exploring the house and helping Mrs. Beatrice. They dined together with Laura. They talked about trivialities, the weather, the day's chores, some news arriving from town, never about feelings, never about the past, never about the future beyond the immediate. Laura began to approach Julianne slowly, like a skittish kitten testing the ground before trusting. She asked if Julianne knew how to read stories. Julianne said yes, so the girl brought a book of fairy tales and asked her to read. They sat together on the porch, a mild autumn afternoon, and Julianne read about princesses, fairies, dragons, and happy endings, which Laura listened to with absolute attention. When she finished, the girl asked if all stories had a happy ending. Julianne hesitated and replied that the best ones did. Laura became thoughtful and then said she hoped her story would have one too. Julianne's heart tightened. She also began to explore the property in her free time. She walked through the pastures, visited the stable, met the hands, observed the work in the tobacco fields. Michael saw her from afar, but did not approach, respecting the implicit agreement of distance. There was a silent kindness in him. He left wildflowers on the breakfast table without saying anything, fixed her chair which had a loose nail without her asking, instructed the employees to treat Julianne with the same respect they treated him. It was on an afternoon of weak sun, almost 2 weeks after her arrival, that Julianne made the discovery that would change everything. She was walking through the back of the property, looking for a suitable place for her medicinal herb plot, when she noticed a stone wall half hidden by invasive vegetation. Curious, she approached and saw that it was an entrance to a fenced area that seemed to have been a garden once. The iron gate was ajar, rusted, covered in vines. Julianne pushed it and entered. What she found took her breath away. It was an extensive garden, perhaps 200 square yards, completely abandoned. But even in abandonment, it was possible to see that this had been a place of extraordinary beauty. There were beds defined by stones, gravel paths almost covered by invasive grass, a central fountain dry for years, wooden benches rotting under the trees, and the plants. Even dying, even choked by weeds, Julianne recognized rare species, an antique rosebush of a variety she had only seen in books, an ancient sweet cherry tree that still tried to produce fruit, vines of blue flowers she knew were native to the region, but almost extinct. There was also a structure that must have been a small greenhouse, glass broken, wood rotting, but still standing stubbornly. Julianne walked through the dead garden, feeling profound sadness. Someone had loved this place. Someone had dedicated time and affection to create this refuge, and then, for some reason, everything had been abandoned, left to die slowly, suffocated by neglect and time. She crouched near an orchid seedling, trying to survive, clinging to a tree trunk. The plant was weak, but alive, fighting against all odds. Julianne touched the leaves with delicacy, whispered to the plant as her mother had taught her, a silent promise that she would save it. She was so absorbed she didn't hear Michael approaching. His voice at her back startled her. "You found the garden," he said with a tone Julianne couldn't decipher. She stood up quickly, feeling she had invaded a forbidden space. "I'm sorry, I didn't know it was private," she began to explain. But Michael shook his head. "It's not private, it's just forgotten." He entered the garden with heavy steps, looking around like someone revisiting a painful ghost. "It was my mother's," he explained finally. "She loved plants, spent years creating this garden, brought cuttings from everywhere, studied books on how to care for each species. It was her favorite place." He walked past Julianne and touched the trunk of the cherry tree with involuntary affection. "She died 10 years ago. After that, I couldn't continue. I didn't know how. And it hurt too much to be here." Julianne understood. It was a living tomb, a memorial abandoned because the pain of maintaining it was greater than the pain of letting it die. "Why didn't you hire someone to tend it?" she asked gently. Michael gave a bitter laugh. "I tried, but no one understood the plants like she did. They killed more than they saved. Eventually I gave up, closed the gate and tried to forget." They stood in silence, listening to the wind in the leaves. Then Julianne gathered her courage. "I can try," she offered with a hesitant voice. "I can try to save what is still alive, bring it back, not as it was, but something new, if you allow it." Michael looked at her with an indecipherable expression. "You know about plants?" Julianne hesitated, but then decided to trust. "My grandmother was a mountain woman, from the deep hills," she told him. "She taught my mother, and my mother taught me. I know how to recognize plants. I know how to care for them. I know what each one needs. It is old knowledge passed from generation to generation. I always hid it because people judge, call it witchcraft. But it is just connection with the earth, respect for what grows." Michael looked at her for a long time. truly seeing her for the first time since they met. "Then do it," he said finally. "If you can bring life back to this place, it would be good." He didn't ask, didn't order. He just gave permission loaded with hidden hope. Julianne nodded, feeling something strange in her chest, something warm spreading slowly. It was the beginning of a shared purpose, the first crack in the wall of distance both had built. That night, lying in bed, Julianne thought of the abandoned garden and the silent man who carried ancient pain like a stone on his back. She thought also of herself, of the knowledge she always hid, of the parts of her identity she kept locked away for fear of judgment. Perhaps there, in that forgotten place in the mountains, she could finally be complete. Perhaps the dead garden and the fake marriage were, in truth, seeds planted in fertile soil, waiting only for the right conditions to germinate into something true and alive. And without fully realizing it, while sleep finally arrived, Julianne began to plan. She thought about which plants to save first, where to get new cuttings, how to restore the beds. She thought also of Michael working beside her, hands in the earth, comfortable silence between them. And for the first time since accepting that marriage of convenience, she felt something that could be, perhaps, just perhaps, the discreet beginning of hope. The first week working in the abandoned garden taught Julianne that bringing life back to what was dead required more than botanical knowledge. It required patience, difficult decisions about what could still be saved and what needed to be let go, and physical strength she didn't know she possessed. She woke before dawn, had a quick coffee, and walked to the back of the property with tools Michael had left for her on the porch. A small hoe, pruning shears, a rake, worn but functional leather gloves. She started with the most basic work, pulling up the invasive weeds, suffocating the original beds, clearing the gravel paths, cleaning the area around the dry fountain. It was grueling work. Julianne's hands, accustomed to holding chalk and books, formed blisters in the first days, which later turned to calluses. Her back ached at the end of every afternoon. Her fingernails turned black with earth no matter how much she scrubbed. But there was something deeply satisfying in that physical exhaustion, in the direct connection with the soil, in seeing tangible progress each day. It was different from teaching, where results took years to appear. Here, every plant she saved responded in days, stretching leaves toward the sun, gaining color, coming back to live. Michael observed from afar in the early days. Julianne occasionally saw him standing at the edge of the garden, leaning on the fence, watching her work without saying anything. She didn't know how to interpret that silence. Was it disapproval, indifference, pain at seeing someone messing in his mother's sacred space? But he never asked her to stop. He just watched with an expression Julianne couldn't decode, and then returned to his chores. It was on the 5th day that he finally approached. Julianne was struggling to remove a dead tree stump blocking one of the main beds. She was digging around it, trying to expose the roots, but the stump was stubborn, stuck in the earth like an old tooth resisting extraction. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Michael with an axe in hand. Without asking permission, without saying anything, he bent down and began to cut the thickest roots with precise blows. They worked in silence for 20 minutes until the stump finally gave way and they could pull it out together. Michael dragged it out of the bed, wiped the axe on the grass, and then looked at Julianne. "Need anything else?" he asked with a neutral voice. She shook her head, thanked him, and he left without adding anything more. But the next day he returned. This time he brought a better shovel than the one she was using, left it leaning against the fence without explanation. The day after that, he appeared with a bucket of manure from the stable, said it might serve to enrich the soil of the beds. Julianne thanked him and used the manure on the antique rose bush that was especially weak. In a week, the plant showed new shoots, a vibrant green that didn't exist before. She commented on the improvement at dinner, and Michael merely nodded with something that almost looked like a hidden smile at the corner of his lips. His visits to the garden became more frequent and longer. First, he stayed only 5 minutes, then 10, then half an hour. He began to help without Julianne asking. He carried heavy stones to reconstruct the borders of the beds. He fixed the irrigation system that brought water from the nearby creek. He cleaned and varnished the wooden benches that were rotting, and while they worked side by side, they began to talk. Not about personal things yet, but about the garden, about the plants, about restoration plans. Julianne explained what each plant needed, sharing knowledge her grandmother had passed to her mother and her mother to her. "That orchid likes shade and constant humidity," she said, pointing. "But this species here needs direct sun at least 4 hours a day." Michael listened with an attention that surprised Julianne. He asked intelligent questions, wanted to understand not just what to do, but why. He began to remember things his mother did, fragments of memory he thought he had lost. "My mother talked to the plants," he revealed one day, with a mixture of nostalgia and embarrassment. "I thought it was strange when I was a boy. But she said they listened, that they responded to affection." Julianne smiled and confessed she did the same thing. "My grandmother said plants have spirits, that they feel the intention of who cares for them. It might seem like superstition, but I swear it works." They shared a shy smile, the first moment of true connection that wasn't just the cordiality of polite strangers, and something small but significant changed between them in that instant. Laura also began to participate in the garden. The girl appeared in the afternoons after finishing the lessons Julianne now gave her in the house. She asked curious questions about every plant, wanted to know names, what they were for, if they could be eaten or used as medicine. Julianne taught with infinite patience. Happy to share knowledge she always had to hide. She showed Laura how to make a succulent cutting just by cutting a leaf and planting it in damp soil. The girl was fascinated when the leaf began to create tiny roots days later. "It's magic," she exclaimed with shining eyes. Julianne explained it wasn't magic. It was the natural miracle of life, finding a way to continue. Laura insisted it was the same thing. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss the next emotional stories. One afternoon, while the three worked together in the garden, Laura looked at Julianne and then at her uncle with a serious expression. "You look like you're married for real now," she commented, with the brutal honesty only a child possesses. "Not like before, when you each stayed in your own corner." Michael tensed, didn't know how to respond. But Julianne, with delicacy, told Laura that a true marriage is built with time, that it doesn't happen overnight just because two people sign a paper. Sometimes it starts slowly, like a planted seed that takes time to sprout. Laura seemed to accept that explanation, went back to her seedlings, but Julianne noticed Michael looking at her with a different expression, as if he were seeing something he hadn't noticed before. It was in mid-May, almost a month after Julianne had started working in the garden, that the first real threat appeared. Eugenia Carver arrived at the farm on a grey afternoon, driven in an elegant carriage pulled by horses that certainly cost a fortune. She was a woman of 40 who still maintained traces of beauty that must have been notable in her youth, but bitterness had etched hard lines around her mouth and between her eyebrows. She wore a fashionable dress from Richmond, a hat with plumes, kid gloves. She carried with her an air of superiority that made it clear she considered this visit to the country a forced descent from her urban pedestal. Julianne was on the porch when the carriage stopped. She didn't know who that woman was, but realized immediately by her posture that it wasn't a friendly visit. Eugenia stepped down without waiting for help, climbed the porch steps with firm strides, and examined Julianne from head to toe with a look that was pure critical assessment. "You must be the new wife," she said, without introducing herself or offering a greeting. Her voice was thin, but cutting like a sharp blade. Julianne confirmed she was, and politely asked who she was. Eugenia smiled without humor. "I am Michael's sister-in-law, widow of his brother, and I am here to protect the family's interests." Michael appeared at the door at that moment, attracted by the sound of voices. When he saw Eugenia, his expression closed, like a door slammed by the wind. "Eugenia," he said with an icy tone, "I didn't know you were coming." She turned to him, ignoring the coldness. "You didn't need to know. I came because I became aware of certain news. I heard you got married. Very convenient, don't you think? Just when you were about to lose custody of Laura to Lydia's family. What an extraordinary coincidence." Michael kept his voice controlled, but Julianne noticed tension in his shoulders. "It is none of your business." Eugenia laughed, an unpleasant sound. "Oh, but it is, because everything involving this farm and this family's name interests me. And frankly, Michael, do you think the judge will believe this marriage is real? A widowed teacher you barely knew 2 months ago. This smells of matrimonial fraud from a mile away." Julianne felt anger rise hot in her chest. "It is not fraud," she intervened with a firm voice. "We are legally married. We have a certificate, witnesses, the blessing of the church." Eugenia looked at her with disdain. "Legal on paper, my dear. But everyone knows marriages of convenience happen. And when I tell Judge Morris about the suspicious circumstances, when I mention that you barely speak, that you sleep in separate rooms, that this is clearly an arrangement to deceive the court, let's see how long this farce lasts." Michael took a step forward with clenched fists. "You have no proof of anything." Eugenia smiled like a snake about to strike. "Not yet. But I will. I will watch. I will ask the help, the townspeople, anyone who can confirm this marriage is a lie. And when I have enough proof, I will go personally to the judge. Because you see, if you lose custody of Laura, and if by chance something happened to you, me being the closest blood relative, this farm would go back to where it should have always stayed. With me, after all, I was married to Thomas, the firstborn, not to you, the youngest who inherited everything by accident." The raw truth finally revealed. Eugenia wasn't worried about Laura. She was worried about property, money, inheritance she thought belonged to her. Michael took a deep breath, trying to control his fury. "Get out of my house," he said with a dangerously low voice, "and don't come back." Eugenia adjusted her gloves with studied calm. "I'm going, but I will return, Michael, for the custody hearing that happens in 3 weeks. And you can be sure I will be watching every move of yours and this convenient wife until then." She left, stomping her feet, got into the carriage and departed, leaving a trail of dust and palpable threat in the air. Michael stood watching the carriage distance itself, jaw tense, hands still clenched. Julianne touched his arm lightly. "Can she really do that?" Michael nodded slowly. "She can try. And if she convinces the judge that our marriage is a fraud, yes, it can create a serious problem. Not just for Laura's custody, but for us too. Marriage fraud is a crime. We could face a lawsuit, fines, jail." Julianne felt a chill down her spine. She hadn't thought of the serious legal ramifications when she accepted the agreement. She had thought only of saving her job, of having a place to live. But now she realized she had stepped onto much more dangerous ground than she imagined. "And you," she asked with a small voice, "you could lose everything? The farm, custody of Laura, your reputation?" Michael looked at her, and something softened in his eyes. "Don't worry," he said with a kindness that contrasted with the anger of moments before. "I will find a solution. I won't let Eugenia destroy this." But Julianne realized he was more worried than he let on. That night during dinner, the silence between them was heavy, loaded with anxiety neither knew how to express. Laura sensed the tension, and ate quietly, without asking the cheerful questions that had become custom. After the girl went to her room, Michael finally spoke. "We are going to need to convince people our marriage is real," he said, looking at the coffee cup he held. "Not just look married, but really demonstrate we are husband and wife. Eugenia will question the staff, the neighbors, anyone who has contact with us. We need to be convincing." Julianne swallowed hard. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Michael hesitated, choosing words. "We need to be seen together more frequently. Go to town together, to church, to social gatherings. We need to demonstrate affection. Nothing exaggerated, but small gestures, holding hands in public, sitting close, speaking with fondness. Things normal couples do." He seemed uncomfortable suggesting that, but Julianne understood the necessity. She agreed that yes, they would do whatever was necessary, but there was something else. Something Michael took a while to mention. "We are also going to need to share the bedroom," he said finally, without looking at her. "At least make it look like we share. Eugenia might bribe servants to spy, might invent an excuse to visit by surprise. If it gets out we sleep in separate rooms, the charade collapses." Julianne felt her heart accelerate. "Share the room?" Michael noticed the panic in her eyes and quickly added, "It doesn't need to be real. We can move your things to my room, make it look like we both use the space. But I can sleep on the sofa in the parlor, or on a pallet on the floor. Nothing will change in truth, only appearances." Julianne breathed, relieved, but also felt a strange pang of something that could be disappointment. She agreed to the plan because there was no alternative. In the following days, they began to stage the true marriage. They moved Julianne's clothes and personal objects to Michael's room, creating the illusion that both slept there. Julianne kept some dresses in his wardrobe, left hairbrushes on the dresser, spread books she was reading on the bedside table. Michael slept on the parlor sofa as promised, waking before everyone so no one would see him there. During the day, they strove to demonstrate the intimacy of an established couple. Michael started calling Julianne dear when someone was nearby. She reciprocated with "my love," said, with a shyness that wasn't totally feigned. He held her hand while walking through the property when they knew employees were watching. She rested her hand on his shoulder when passing, a casual gesture of a wife accustomed to her husband's touch. On Sunday, they went together to service in town for the first time. They sat side by side in the pew, shoulders touching. When the parson asked the faithful to join hands to pray the Lord's Prayer, Michael interlaced his fingers with Julianne's, and she realized his hands were rough from work, but warm and firm. They held hands longer than necessary after the prayer ended. After the service, they stood at the church door talking to acquaintances, Michael keeping his arm lightly resting on Julianne's waist, she smiling at comments about how they made a handsome couple. They were acting, but the line between acting and truth was starting to get blurry and confusing. It was during that forced performance that something unexpected began to happen. The gestures that started as theater were gradually becoming natural. Michael's hand on Julianne's waist began to feel correct, as if it had always been there. The smiles they exchanged in public began to extend to private moments. The conversations, previously limited to the garden and practical matters, began to include small but significant confidences. One night, sitting on the porch after Laura went to sleep, Michael told her about Thomas, the older brother who died in a horse accident 5 years earlier. "He was better than me at everything," Michael said with a voice loaded with ancient guilt. "Smarter, more sociable, more prepared to inherit. My father always made it clear Thomas would get the farm. I was just the spare plan B, and then he died, and suddenly everything was mine. But I never felt worthy, never felt I deserved what should have been his. Eugenia never forgave me for being alive while Thomas is dead. I understand her anger, even if it doesn't justify her actions." Julianne listened in silence and then shared her own history. She told about the first unhappy marriage, about the years of emotional loneliness while married, about how she thought that would be her entire life until death freed her. She told about the shame she felt regarding her ancestral knowledge, of having hidden an essential part of who she was for fear of rejection. "I never felt whole," she confessed, "always divided between the woman society wanted me to be and the woman I really was inside." Michael looked at her with an intensity that made Julianne avert her eyes. "You seem very whole to me," he said with a low voice. "More whole than most people I know." Julianne felt heat rise to her face, something moving in her chest that wasn't just gratitude for kind words. The garden continued to bloom under their joint care. The antique rose bush, previously half dead, now exploded in buds that opened into pale pink roses. The ancient sweet cherry tree produced fruit for the first time in years, small, dark and sweet cherries that Laura ate straight from the branch. The orchids Julianne saved began to flower, vibrant colors of purple, white and yellow. The gravel path was clean and defined. The central fountain, which Michael fixed bringing water back, now gushed a tranquil sound that filled the space. The renovated wooden benches were the perfect place to sit and appreciate the transformation. Julianne had created a special plot just for medicinal plants: lemon balm, mint, chamomile, boldo, mullein, arnica. She taught Laura what each was for, how to prepare teas, how to make salves. The girl absorbed everything with infinite curiosity. Mrs. Beatrice began to use the herbs in the kitchen and in home remedies, praising the quality. Even the other hands came to ask for help when someone in the family fell ill. Julianne saw herself, for the first time in her life, respected and valued for knowledge she previously needed to hide, and this was largely due to the fact that Michael never demonstrated judgment, only genuine admiration. One afternoon, while they worked together transplanting new seedlings Julianne got in town, she commented on how beautiful the garden was again. Michael agreed, but then added something that caught Julianne by surprise. "It's not just the garden that came back to life," he said, without taking his eyes off the earth where he was planting. "This whole house seems different, lighter, less lonely." Laura laughs more. Beatrice sings while she cooks, something she hasn't done in years. "And I also feel different." He finally looked at Julianne. "You brought life to this place, not just to the plants, to everything." Julianne didn't know how to answer. She just smiled, feeling something warm and sweet spreading through her chest. Michael held her gaze for a moment too long to be casual, and then they returned to work with hands slightly trembling and hearts beating a little faster. But Eugenia's threat hovered over them like a storm cloud. They knew she was fulfilling her promise to investigate. Rumors arrived from town that Michael's sister-in-law was asking questions, talking to merchants, to acquaintances, trying to collect any evidence proving the marriage was a farce. Some hands said an elegant woman had offered money for them to talk about the couple's routine on the farm. Fortunately, loyalty to Michael was strong, and no one accepted the bribe. Mrs. Beatrice one afternoon called Julianne into the kitchen and said with a low voice, "You know I've known Michael since he was a boy," she began while kneading dough. "Watched him grow, saw all his sufferings. First he lost his mother, then lost a girl he loved, died of yellow fever before they could marry, then lost his brother. He closed his heart after so much loss, but lately he is different. He looks at you in a way I haven't seen him look at anyone in 15 years. Just wanted you to know that." Julianne was speechless. Mrs. Beatrice continued kneading the bread as if she hadn't just dropped an emotional bomb. "I don't know how this marriage started," proceeded the cook without looking at Julianne, "and it's none of my business. But I know how to recognize when something true is growing, and it is growing between you two, even if you haven't realized it completely yet. So my advice, if you allow me, don't let fear or pride ruin this. Life is too short to waste when happiness appears. Those words echoed in Julianne's head for the following days. She began to observe Michael with new eyes, looking for signs of what Mrs. Beatrice had mentioned. And the more she observed, the more she noticed small details that previously passed unnoticed. The way he always waited for her to sit before starting to eat. How he left the prettiest flowers from the garden on her table without ever mentioning it. How he laughed at her jokes, a genuine laugh that illuminated his normally serious face. How he asked about her day with real interest, not just courtesy. How he had started to touch her more frequently, even when there was no one watching. A hand on the shoulder when passing, fingers correcting a lock of hair falling on her face. A lingering touch when handing something over. Julianne also caught herself doing things without thinking. Preparing his coffee exactly how he liked it without him asking, sewing a button on his coat that was loose, starting to look for reasons to be near him, to work beside him in the garden, even when she could do that task alone. Caught herself smiling upon seeing him from afar, feeling her heart race when she heard his voice. The inconvenient truth began to settle in. The marriage that was supposed to be a farce was becoming dangerously real. At least for her. And perhaps, if Mrs. Beatrice was right, for him too. It was on a night of full moon, 2 weeks before the custody hearing, that the first serious crack appeared in the facade they maintained. Julianne woke in the middle of the night, thirsty. She got up from the room, went down silently to the kitchen, and found Michael in the parlor. He was lying on the sofa where he slept every night, but he wasn't sleeping. He had an arm folded under his head, looking at the ceiling, a tormented expression illuminated by the moonlight entering through the window. Julianne hesitated at the door. "Are you all right?" she asked softly, so as not to startle him. Michael turned his head and saw her there, in a white nightgown, hair loose falling over her shoulders, bare feet. "Can't sleep?" he asked instead of answering. She said she was thirsty, but now realized he was the one who seemed tormented. She sat in the armchair near the sofa. "Want to talk?" she offered. Michael remained silent for a long time. Then he began to speak, voice low-loaded with emotion he rarely let show. "I'm afraid," he confessed. "Afraid of losing Laura. She has already lost so much. I don't want her to lose more, and I'm afraid of having dragged you into a dangerous situation. If Eugenia manages to prove our marriage is fraud, you will suffer consequences too. It's not fair. You don't deserve this." Julianne felt tenderness invade her chest. "I knew what I was getting into," she said gently, "and I don't regret it, not one bit." Michael sat up on the sofa, feet on the floor, elbows resting on knees, looking at her with intensity that made the air seem denser. "Why?" he asked. "Why don't you regret it? This isn't what you expected from life. It isn't the marriage any woman dreams of." Julianne took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "When I married the first time," she started slowly, "I had expectations. I believed in romantic love, in happy endings, in every fantasy they teach us since we are little. And that marriage broke me, because the reality was cruelty disguised as respect. When I came here, I had no expectations. I was just trying to survive. But I found something I didn't expect." She paused, gathering courage. "I found real respect. I found purpose. I found a place where I can be who I really am. And I found—" She hesitated on the edge of the confession that would change everything. Michael waited, barely breathing. "Found what?" he insisted with a husky voice. Julianne looked directly into his eyes. "I found someone who makes me want to believe again, who makes me feel things I thought I wouldn't feel anymore, who makes me forget this marriage started as a cold agreement, because now, it seems anything but cold. The silence that followed was charged with possibility. Michael stood up slowly, walked to where Julianne was sitting, knelt in front of her so they were at the same height. "Julianne," he said with a choked voice. "Me too. I feel it too. This marriage started as a lie, but you are the truest thing that happened in my life in a long time." Their hands met, fingers interlacing with an urgency that wasn't acting. Michael lifted Julianne's hand and kissed the knuckles calloused by work in the garden, a gesture of reverence that made her eyes sting. They stayed like that, foreheads almost touching, breaths mixed, on the threshold of something both wanted but were afraid to cross completely. It was Julianne who finally said what both were thinking. "We don't need to pretend anymore," she whispered. "Not when we are alone." Michael agreed with an almost imperceptible nod. "We don't need to," he repeated. "But then what are we? What is this between us?" Julianne smiled with sweet sadness. "I don't know yet, but I want to find out. Without haste, without pressure, just truth." Michael smiled back, the first complete and genuine smile she saw on him. "Truth," he agreed, and they sealed that silent agreement with a long, tight hug, full of unspoken promises. When Julianne returned to the room that night, her heart was different, lighter, more hopeful, more scared, because now she had something real to lose. The fake marriage turning into true love was unknown and terrifying territory. But it was also, she realized, lying in bed looking at the ceiling, exactly what she had always looked for without knowing. And in the following days, the truth they confessed to each other on that moonlit night began to change everything in a subtle but profound way. They were no longer just two strangers fulfilling a contract. They were two people rediscovering together what it means to trust, to care, and perhaps, just perhaps, to love truly. The last days before the custody hearing dragged on like cold honey dripping from a spoon. Julianne woke every morning with a weight in her stomach, a mixture of anxiety for what was to come and confusion about what was happening between her and Michael. After that night of confessions under the moonlight, something fundamental had changed. They didn't pretend anymore when they were alone. The touches were real, the looks lingered, the conversations deepened, revealing layers of personality both had kept hidden. Michael began sleeping in the room with her, but maintaining a respectful distance. He set up a sort of makeshift divider with an old screen he found in the attic, creating two separate spaces within the same room. He said it was to keep up appearances, in case someone entered by surprise. But Julianne suspected there was more to it. It was a way to be close without crossing a line both were not yet ready to cross. At night, they talked in the dark, each on their side of the screen, sharing childhood stories, secret fears, abandoned dreams. The intimacy of those moments was deeper than many consummated marriages. One early morning, Julianne woke to the sound of Michael moving on the other side of the screen. She asked softly if he was okay. He took a while to answer, and when he did, his voice was loaded with emotion. "I dreamed of my mother," he told her. "She was in the garden like it was before she died, and you were there too, tending the plants. My mother looked at me and said, I had found what she always wanted for me, someone who understood that the most valuable things need constant care, patience, time." He paused. "I woke up and realized it wasn't just a dream. It's true. You understand that in a way I never understood alone." Julianne felt tears prick her eyes. "Your mother seems to have been a wise woman," she replied with a choked voice. Michael agreed in silence, and then said something that made Julianne's heart race. "I wish you had met her. She would have loved you. And I am starting to realize that I love too." The last word hung suspended in the air between them, heavy and precious. Julianne didn't know how to answer. The declaration was so raw, so vulnerable, that it seemed wrong to treat it lightly. so she just reached out her hand behind the screen, fingers searching in the dark. Michael's hand found hers, and they stayed like that until dawn, fingers interlaced, hearts beating in synchronized rhythm. The day of the hearing arrived on a dry and cold June morning, typical of early summer in the mountains. Julianne put on her best outfit, the grey dress with lace details she reserved for important occasions. She pinned her hair in an elegant bun, put on the shawl her mother made, took a deep breath before the mirror. Michael appeared at the door of the room wearing a dark suit that made him look even more imposing. He observed her for a moment with an expression Julianne couldn't completely decipher, but which seemed to mix admiration, gratitude, and something deeper. "You look beautiful," he said with a husky voice. Julianne felt heat rise to her face. "Thank you. You look very handsome too." They smiled at each other, shared nervousness creating a connection words couldn't express. Michael approached and for the first time kissed her forehead slowly, a gesture of tenderness that made Julianne close her eyes. "We will face this together," he said firmly. "No matter what happens, we are together." Julianne nodded, holding his hand with a strength that was an anchor and a promise. Laura would stay with Mrs. Beatrice during the trial. The girl hugged both before they left, and Julianne realized she understood, even being so young, the importance of that day. "Come back soon," she asked with a small voice. Michael promised they would, affectionately ruffled his niece's hair, and then he and Julianne departed in the buggy toward town. The hearing would be at the courthouse, an imposing two-story building in the town center, all built of stone and dark wood. When they arrived, Eugenia was already there, accompanied by two elegant lawyers from the capital. She wore a dark green velvet dress, discreet but expensive jewelry, a hat with a fine veil that didn't completely hide the expression of arrogant satisfaction. Beside her were Lydia's parents, Laura's maternal grandparents, a middle-aged couple looking like they belonged to high society. They were the ones officially petitioning for custody, claiming they could offer refined education, social opportunities, and a more suitable environment for a girl who should be prepared to marry well in the future. Judge Morris was a man in his 60s, white hair, round spectacles, an expression that oscillated between severe and bored. He called everyone into the courtroom, a small space with wooden benches, a long desk where the judge would sit, heavy air of decisions that changed lives. Julianne and Michael sat on one side, Eugenia and Lydia's parents on the other, like opposing teams in a judicial battle. Lydia's parents' lawyer began presenting arguments. He spoke about the emotional instability of a girl who lost her parents, about the importance of a structured family environment, about how a single man had no conditions to offer appropriate education for a young lady of good family. Then, with a dramatic pause, he mentioned that although Michael had recently contracted matrimony, there were serious doubts about the legitimacy of that marriage. He directly accused it of being a union of convenience, arranged in haste specifically to deceive the court. Michael stood up to defend himself, but the judge asked him to wait his turn. Eugenia was called as a witness. She walked up to the small stand with the posture of someone who already had victory guaranteed. Under oath, she declared that her brother-in-law's marriage was clearly fraudulent, said Michael and Julianne barely knew each other before marrying, that the ceremony was performed in a rush, that there were no demonstrations of genuine affection between them. Mentioned she had information that the couple slept in separate rooms, that Julianne was a teacher who desperately needed to keep a job requiring a married civil status. Painted a convincing picture of two individuals using the sacred institution of matrimony for practical benefits. Julianne felt anger boil, but Michael squeezed her hand discreetly under the table, asking for patience. When it was his turn to speak, Michael stood up with a calm that impressed Julianne. "Your Honor," he began, addressing the judge. "It is true that my marriage to Julianne started in an unconventional way. I will not lie about that. It wasn't a romance of years. It wasn't a striking passion. It was a practical agreement between two people who needed to solve problems society imposes." The raw honesty caught everyone by surprise. Eugenia smiled, thinking he was confessing the fraud. But Michael continued, "However, what started as an agreement transformed into something I didn't expect, and which is more real than many marriages that start with grand parties and empty promises." He looked directly at Julianne while speaking. "Julianne taught me things I had forgotten, taught me it is possible to rebuild what was dead, that it is possible to trust again after losing so much, that it is possible to love in a quiet, gradual, solid way. It is not theatre love, it is not cheap romance passion, it is love of shared work, of deep conversations, of mutual respect that grows every day like a well-tended plant." He turned back to the judge. "My wife brought life back to my house, not just for me, but for Laura. The girl who was closed in sadness since she lost her parents now laughs again, learns valuable things, has a loving and wise female presence. And before anyone questions Julianne's wisdom, let me say something." His voice became firmer, more challenging. "My wife carries ancestral knowledge about medicinal plants, heritage from her grandmother of mountain blood. It is knowledge that saved lives, that cures illnesses, that is being lost because people like Mrs. Eugenia call it witchcraft or savagery. But it is ancient science, tested by generations. It is wisdom that should be honored, not hidden." The silence in the room was absolute. Eugenia was red with rage. Lydia's parents exchanged uncomfortable looks. The judge had a neutral but attentive expression. Michael proceeded. "If this court wants proof my marriage is real, I can offer witnesses. I can show the garden we rebuilt together, where every plant is a symbol of what we are building. I can bring people from the community who saw our dedication to one another. But the greatest proof, Your Honor, is this. I love my wife. I love her in a way I haven't loved anyone in 15 years, and she loves me too. Is that fraud? Using the institution of marriage to find true companionship, genuine respect, love that grows with time. If that is fraud, then half the traditional marriages are too, because they start with less substance than ours." Julianne had tears streaming silently down her face. Michael had just defended her publicly, not just as a wife, but as a complete woman, honoring parts of her she always had to hide. He had declared his love before a room full of people, before the law, before God. It wasn't an agreement anymore. It was absolute truth. The judge asked for silence to deliberate. He flipped through papers, made notes, and finally spoke. "Mr. Carver, it is uncommon to hear such honesty in this court. Most try to hide imperfections. You exposed them and then showed how you transformed imperfection into virtue." He paused. "As to the question of custody, I need to consider the best interest of the minor. And frankly, what I see here is a man who loves his niece enough to change his life, to build a suitable home, to find a partner who clearly cares about the family's well-being." He turned to Lydia's parents. "With all respect to your grief for the loss of your daughter, taking the girl from the only home she knows, from the only paternal blood family she has, to satisfy the desire of grandparents, that does not seem to me to be in her best interest." Eugenia tried to protest, but the judge raised his hand asking for silence. "As for you, Mrs. Eugenia, your motivations are transparent. You are not worried about the girl. You are worried about property you think belongs to you. This court is not the place to resolve family greed." Her face went pale with fury and humiliation. The judge banged the gavel. "Custody of the minor Laura Carver remains with her uncle Michael Carver and his wife Julianne Vance Carver. This case is closed." The relief that flooded Julianne was physical, like a wave that almost knocked her over. Michael hugged her right there in front of everyone, a tight and prolonged hug that had nothing of pretense. He murmured in her ear words only she heard. "Thank you for everything, for being here, for being you, for making me believe again." Julianne responded, tightening the hug, incapable of forming words because emotion closed her throat. Eugenia left the room stomping, without looking back. Lydia's parents approached Michael with a defeated but not hostile expression. The deceased's father extended his hand. "I am sorry if we caused trouble," he said with a tired voice. "We only wanted the best for our granddaughter." Michael shook his hand firmly. "She will always be your granddaughter. You can visit her whenever you want. She needs to know her mother's family." The couple thanked him with visible relief and left less enemies than they had entered. The trip back to the farm was different from the way there. There was lightness in the air, as if an invisible weight had been removed. Michael drove the buggy with one hand, the other holding Julianne's hand on the bench seat. They talked little, but the silence was comfortable, full of unspoken promises. When they arrived at the farm, Laura ran to meet them on the porch, Mrs. Beatrice right behind, smiling. Michael picked his niece up and announced she would stay with them forever. The joy on the girl's face was pure and luminous, and Julianne felt her heart expand with love for that child who was becoming an essential part of her life. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for more emotional stories of true love. That night, there was a small but significant celebration. Mrs. Beatrice prepared a special dinner. They ate, talked, laughed more than they had laughed in weeks. After Laura went to sleep, Michael and Julianne went out to walk in the garden under the starlight. The air was cold and clean, sky clear, showing brilliant constellations. They walked along the paths they had rebuilt together, passing the plants they saved, the fountain singing softly, the benches where they so often sat to talk. Michael stopped near the antique rose bush, the one that was almost dead when Julianne arrived and now exploded in fragrant flowers. He picked a rose carefully, avoiding the thorns, and offered it to Julianne. She accepted, touching the soft petals. "This rose," Michael began, "was dying. I had given up on it. But you didn't give up. You saw life where I only saw death. And now look at it." Julianne understood the metaphor. "Are you talking about the rose, or about you?" she asked softly. Michael smiled. "Both. About me, about this garden, about this house, about my heart. You brought everything back to life." Julianne took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "And you," she said with a choked voice, "gave me a place where I can be whole, where I don't need to hide parts of me, where I can love without fear." Their hands met between them, fingers interlacing with an urgency that was no longer new, but still powerful. Michael raised his free hand and touched her face with the delicacy of one touching something precious and fragile. "Julianne," he said with a husky voice, "I know our marriage started as an agreement, but now I want it to be real in every sense. I want to wake up beside you every day. I want to build a true life with you. I want you to know that my vows, which I said that cold morning in church, only out of obligation, are now absolute truth. I love you, completely. In a way that scares me, in a way I never thought I would feel again." Tears flowed freely down Julianne's face now. "I love you too," she confessed. "I love you in a way I didn't know. I love your silent kindness, your strength, your vulnerability. I love the way you care for the people around you, the way you brought my identity back to me, the way you look at me as if I were enough. You make me feel enough." Michael pulled her to him, and the kiss they shared wasn't the chaste touch of the wedding ceremony. It was a true, deep kiss, full of months of accumulated tension, guarded feelings, contained desire. It was a kiss that sealed a promise more serious than any contract, the promise of two hearts consciously choosing to surrender to one another. When they separated, both were breathless, Foreheads resting on each other, hands still clutching as if letting go meant losing something precious. They returned to the house holding hands, and that night the screen dividing the room was removed. They no longer needed physical or emotional barriers. The marriage that started as a convenient lie finally consummated in absolute truth. With tenderness, respect, and love, they had cultivated together like patient gardeners tending a precious seed. The following months were of quiet and deep happiness. Julianne continued teaching, but now also began offering consultations on medicinal plants to families in the region. Michael supported her completely, helping to build a small clinic in the back of the house where she attended those in need. The community that previously looked with suspicion at that ancestral knowledge began to respect it when they saw concrete results. Fevers breaking with the right teas, wounds healing with specific salves, chronic pains alleviated with treatments the town doctors couldn't resolve. Laura grew happy, surrounded by love and attention. She called Julianne Aunt, and the affection between them was genuine and beautiful to see. The girl spent hours in the garden learning plant names, helping tend the beds, asking infinite questions Julianne answered with inexhaustible patience. The garden became famous in the region. People came from afar to see the rare species Julianne had saved and the new ones she had planted. She created an educational area where she taught other women about medicinal botany, passing on the knowledge her grandmother and mother transmitted to her. It was a way to honor ancestry, to ensure that wisdom wouldn't be lost, to transform ancient shame into legitimate pride. Michael prospered too, not just in business, but as a person. He laughed more, spoke more, left the wall around his heart completely dismantled. He developed a habit of picking flowers from the garden every morning to leave on Julianne's breakfast table, a small but constant gesture she adored. They had a routine of walking together through the garden every night before sleeping, a sacred moment where they talked about the day, about dreams, about future plans. Mrs. Beatrice observed everything with the satisfaction of someone who had predicted the result from the start. "I knew it," she commented one afternoon to Julianne while preparing preserves. "Knew you two were made for each other, just needed time to realize." Julianne thanked the cook for having been a silent witness and gentle encourager during the whole process. In November, almost 8 months after the trial, Michael made a proposal to Julianne. They were in the garden, a warm spring afternoon, flowers blooming in an explosion of colors. He led her to the central fountain and asked her to sit on the bench beside it. He had something in his hands, a small carved wooden box. "Julianne," he started with a charming nervousness she rarely saw in him, "I know we are already married, that we already exchanged vows, but those vows were said when our hearts were still closed. I want to do it again. I want to renew our vows, but this time with full awareness of what we are promising. This time with true love." He opened the box, revealing 2 simple gold bands. They weren't the ones they had used in the first wedding. Those had been chosen in haste by the parson. These Michael had made especially, with an engraving inside, "From the dead garden, new life." Julianne began to cry with emotion. "Yes," she said with a choked voice. "Yes, I want to renew the vows. I want to promise again, but this time with my whole heart." The renewal ceremony happened in December, almost a complete year after the original wedding. It was held in the garden itself, under the ancient sweet cherry tree that was producing abundant fruit. The parson agreed to come out to the farm. Only the closest people were present: Mrs. Beatrice, Laura, some loyal hands, neighbors who had become friends. It wasn't a big celebration, but it was perfect in its intimacy. Julianne wore a simple white dress she sewed herself, with wildflowers from the garden woven into her hair. Michael wore a new suit, nervous like a real groom. When they exchanged vows, the words were completely different from the ones said a year earlier. They spoke about individual journeys that intertwined, about dead gardens that were reborn, about practical agreements that transformed into deep love. They promised not perfection, but constant effort. They promised not passion that burns fast, but love that grows slowly and lasts forever. They promised to care for each other as they cared for the plants, with patience, daily dedication, respect for individual needs. When the parson declared them husband and wife again, the kiss they exchanged was witnessed by the whole garden that had been the setting and symbol of their transformation. It was a kiss of celebration, of gratitude, of renewed promise. And all present applauded with genuine joy, because it was impossible not to be moved seeing two hearts that had met in the most unlikely place, in a cold agreement that destiny warmed until it became a sacred fire. The party was simple, but joyful. Mrs. Beatrice prepared delicious food. There was music, dancing, laughter. Laura was radiant, wearing a special little dress Julianne had made for her, telling anyone who would listen she had a real family now. At night, when the guests left, Michael and Julianne stayed alone in the garden lit by lanterns and stars. He picked her up in his arms, a romantic gesture that made her laugh, and carried her into the house in a dramatic reenactment of a honeymoon tradition. Time continued passing, bringing seasons that alternated, each painting the garden with different colors. Explosive springs of flowers, green and humid summers, golden autumns, winters cold but never desolate, because there was always something growing. Julianne and Michael's love followed the same rhythm. Constant growth, different seasons but always alive, always renewing itself. 2 years after the renewal of vows, on an April morning that marked exactly 3 years since Julianne arrived at the farm for the first time, she woke feeling something different. Slight nausea, unusual fatigue, tenderness. She recognized the signs because she had read about them, had heard other women describe them, but had never experienced them personally. Her first marriage had been sterile, and she had believed the problem was her body. But now, with Michael, life found a way to manifest in all forms. She waited 2 more weeks to be sure before telling. One night, after dinner, she asked Michael to walk with her to the garden. They sat on the favorite bench near the antique rose bush. Julianne held his hands and, with a voice trembling with emotion, announced she was expecting a baby. Michael's expression went through various phases in seconds: shock, disbelief, and finally pure and intense joy. He hugged her tightly, laughing and crying at the same time, repeating he couldn't believe it, that it was a gift he had never allowed himself to dream of. The pregnancy was calm and happy. Michael became even more attentive, if that was possible, carried things for her, insisted she rest, read to her at night. Laura was excited with the idea of having a little cousin, already planning how she would teach everything she had learned about plants. Mrs. Beatrice knitted tiny clothes with the dedication of a true grandmother. The baby was born in January of the following year, on a bright and cold winter morning. It was a healthy boy, with strong lungs that announced his arrival with a vigorous cry. They named him Thomas Michael, honoring the brother Michael lost, and his own father. The baby had dark hair like both of them, and when he finally opened his eyes days later, they were deep brown that seemed to know ancient secrets. Seeing Michael holding his son for the first time with absolute tenderness and almost religious reverence made Julianne fall in love with him again, even more deeply. "This moment," said Michael with a choked voice, looking at the baby and then at her, "is proof that the most beautiful miracles are born from the most unlikely beginnings. Who would say a fake marriage would generate such true life?" Julianne smiled through tears of happiness. "It wasn't the marriage that was fake," she corrected gently. "It was our understanding of it that was wrong. The truth was always there, waiting for us to notice." Michael agreed, kissing first the baby's forehead, then her lips. "You're right, as you always are." The following years were of abundance. The family grew in love, the garden flourished in beauty, the farm prospered in production. Julianne became a regional reference in medicinal botany, even writing a small manual on native plants and their therapeutic uses. Michael expanded business, but never lost the habit of working beside his wife in the garden every afternoon, a sacred moment of the day that belonged only to them. Laura grew strong and intelligent, decided to study medicine to combine modern science with ancestral knowledge Julianne taught her. Thomas grew surrounded by love, exploring the garden with infinite curiosity, learning early to respect and care for the earth. And eventually, more children came, filling the house with laughter and that organized mess only a big and happy family manages to create. But the story that matters, the one that needs to be told and remembered, is not about quantity of children or material prosperity. It is about two people who accepted a practical agreement in a moment of desperation and then did something extraordinary with that opportunity. They transformed obligation into choice, transformed convenience into commitment, transformed forced proximity into true intimacy, transformed a dead garden into a living paradise. It is about discovering that true love doesn't need to start with striking passion or cinematic romance. It can start with a cold contract and a signed paper. It can grow slowly, like a seed planted in good soil, watered with respect, warmed by coexistence, strengthened by challenges faced together. This type of love, which starts small and grows firm, frequently lasts longer and goes deeper than the passion that burns strong and fast. Years later, when they were old and their grey hair shone under the afternoon sun, Julianne and Michael still walked together through the garden every evening. The wrinkled hands remained interlaced with a strength the years didn't diminish. The garden had expanded, now cared for also by children and grandchildren who learned that love and plants need the same things: time, patience, constant dedication. One afternoon, sitting under the sweet cherry tree that was now an ancient giant, one of the grandchildren asked how the grandparents met. Michael and Julianne exchanged a knowing look, a shared smile of those who keep a precious secret. "The story is long," Julianne began, "but I can summarize it like this. Your grandfather and I made an agreement that seemed simple and practical, but we discovered that no agreement involving two hearts can remain simple. Either it becomes a complete lie or it transforms into absolute truth. We were lucky. Ours became truth." Michael squeezed her hand, adding with a voice still firm despite his age, "And the truth is this. The best marriage of my life started as the falsest marriage. But the love that grew from it is the most real thing I have ever known, more real than anything else in this world." He looked at his wife with a tenderness 50 years together hadn't diminished. Still is the most real thing. And so ends the story of Julianne and Michael, two strangers who signed a matrimonial contract for practical reasons on a cold morning in 1902, and spent the rest of their lives proving that the truest loves can be born from the most unexpected places, that abandoned gardens can bloom again, that hardened hearts can soften, that cold agreements can warm until they become a fire that never goes out. Because in the end, true love is not about how it starts. It is about how one dedicates, cultivates, nurtures every single day. It is about choosing again and again that same person. It is about building together something neither of the two could achieve alone. It is about transforming convenience into commitment and commitment into devotion. And if there is greater proof that miracles happen, it is seeing a marriage that was supposed to be fake turn into the truest love two people can know.